and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. Today we are going to discuss a little bit about something that falls under the header of how groups can exploit the fear and uncertainty and hopelessness that accompany disasters or troubles in somebody's life, and use those events in order to either gain converts or bind existing converts closer to them. And it all does this with a number of different things that really kind of come down to obedience. And we're going to look specifically at how that is manifest in a recent, very popular trending video that was published by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, this is taking place in the middle of the 2020 coronavirus epidemic. That is now a pandemic and is significantly affecting the lives of church members worldwide. It includes the church shutting down all services worldwide, closing temples, and a lot of different events that aren't confined just to the church itself, but are fears and uncertainty that people in and out of the church have. So the first thing that I want to do is get Yu-Gi-Oh to calm down. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh, I got this big old dental stick for you. All right, this should keep you occupied for a very long time. It looks like a churro. I don't think it's a churro, though. Okay, so how do we know that groups actually do this? Well, I mean, you can look at Scientology, you can look at Jehovah's Witnesses, you can look at any number of groups that even a believing Mormon would say, oh, those groups really are, exploiting people. And you can see that sort of mechanism take place. But even more to the point, when Hollywood or movie writers want to create a story that involves these groups that weave themselves into the lives and minds of their members and exercise undue influence or control over them, that's one of the things that they depict. And this is seen most recently in the series called The Path. If you're not familiar with The Path, it is a series, I think it came out on Hulu. It has Aaron Paul, who first became popular in the series Breaking Bad. He's the producer of it, and they just got some really intelligent and informed story runners and script writers to depict what it looks like for a group to start to grow by exploiting fear, exploiting disaster. And that actually is something that happens in the very first scene of the series. If you haven't had a chance to actually see the series, I highly recommend it. It's really good. But let's see if we can bring this up here, and we'll bring up The Path. Now, what you're going to see in this clip is how the storytellers set the stage, and that is that there's been a tornado that's hit a community, and the group that the story is about is so in tune with the fact that people who have had their lives really affected by disaster, by destabilizing events, are very vulnerable. They have the greatest need. They have nothing else. They have a sense of hopelessness. And when the group comes in, particularly if it can come in before state or other rescue responders, they're able to really latch on to people and make them dependent upon them for the hope that they don't have, for the salvation that they don't have. And just by being there at the right time and really capitalizing on those events, they can bind people to them. And you'll see that some of the people, there's a young woman in particular who they capture this woman at the most desperate point in her life, and then she becomes bound to the group, and that comes out through the rest of the story. So let's take a look at this event. It's going to start out, there's this one iconic scene that when I see the church start to jump on world events, I really recalls to my mind from here, and that is when the young woman is standing up over the debris and the desolation and sees that even before firefighters, emergency responders are there, the group comes and is there to provide assistance. So let's take a look here.
Somebody help me! Stop! Don't drink that water!
Ma'am, we're gonna take care of your baby. What do you need?
My wife,
Your wife is missing?
her picture, her photo. It's all I have left of her.
Help this man find his wife.
So you get a sense of kind of the power of what they're depicting here. And when you first see this and when you encounter it, I mean, these people are doing a much needed thing. They are helping people who are in need. As the story plays out, though, you realize that that help is tied into an overall strategy to try to bring people under the spell of their doctrine, which places them under the hierarchy of their leadership. And that makes them, their lives are transformed by how the group itself then exerts control over them in the past. It started out when they were at the most desperate part of their life. And if this group had approached them at a time other than when they had nothing left to lose and they were in desperate need before this tornado, then a significant number of the people would not have really gotten into that group. But that is why these groups do this. They target times of vulnerability in persons' lives. And it could be something like a natural disaster, like we're seeing here, or it could be something like realizing that there's a point in everybody's life where you are vulnerable to new ideas, where you're branching out and trying to shape and formulate your own identity as separate from your parents. And those of us that have been through it know that that is something that happens in college. And this is why when you look at groups that people call cults or something like that, you'll see that a lot of them do a great deal of recruiting on college campuses. This is something particularly true of the Moonies, for example. They have a number of front organizations that don't seem to have any ties to a particular church, but capture students at a vulnerable part of their life where they're trying to really branch out and discover new things and create an identity for themselves. Scientology is another group that does this by having kind of shell organizations that have names that don't seem to have anything to do with Scientology, but do it. Again, all of this is under the heading of groups taking advantage of people who are at a desperate or transitional or vulnerable point in their life. Now, how does this actually relate to the Mormon church and the coronavirus? Well, I guess the first question is, does the Mormon church actually engage in this type of targeted proselytizing or targeted way of approaching people? Do they have a strategy of identifying people who have had great loss or great harm in their life and then tapping into those fears, into that sense of hopelessness in order to get them while they're vulnerable? Well, there was a missionary training video that was published on the church website a few years ago, which really kind of opened the door to a a blatant form of this type of targeting, where you identify vulnerable populations who are in need and you specifically go and provide them with your message. And that message is shrouded in notions of love, assistance, healing, salvation, transformation, all of those things, which may be good in and of themselves, but when they are married to an accompanying theme of obedience and of substituting the decisions and the morality and the judgments of leaders over you for your own, preferring their judgment over your own, then it can really start to transform and affect your life in a way that you may not realize. And that's what happens here in this show, The Path. And if you look at how the church has influenced people's lives, particularly around issues of social importance, then you can see that there is that thread running through it as well. So let's take a look at a video called Targeting the Vulnerable. This is a video that you'll find on the Thinker of Thought's webpage. It starts out with a review of one of the concepts that's central to this, and then takes a clip from some of the older research. You'll see a significant figure in cult psychology and trying to inform and educate people about how this group takes control. And then we will see one of a familiar church leader instructing missionaries on how to target people. So let me cue that up here, and we'll start there. Self-destabilization is an important concept to understand when learning about how controlling groups recruit new members. Individuals who have already been destabilized by normal, troubling life situations are particularly vulnerable to messages that groups may give them about how they can overcome those life difficulties and achieve a more ideal situation. Because these groups make promises that adhering to their teachings or joining with the organization will solve many of these life difficulties, the groups specifically target people in these unstable periods of their life for recruitment.
After interviewing people, that I came to realize that these young women that I'd interviewed had not gone out looking for a cult, that they had simply been at a vulnerable position in their life, and a cult recruiter got them to come to the group and accept a lot of the flattery and the charming attention that they were given. And when a person is lonely and in between meaningful jobs, meaningful relationships, we're all vulnerable to flattery and false promises, so that across time, most of us who study cults have discovered that it's not any special type of person that gets in a cult, but it's people who are approached by a cult recruiter at a vulnerable period in their life.
William Goldberg and Lorna Goldberg are clinical social workers who counsel former cult members. Jim Guerra was attending a prestigious Ivy League university when he was recruited into a group known as the Garbage Eaters. Lori Schaffler was recruited 2 weeks before she was to begin college in her native state of Washington.
It seems that you were both experiencing the normal stresses of growing up, and you were in a period of transition.
Transition times are times of particular vulnerability to the appeal of groups like the cults. It can occur when we go away to college for the first time. It can occur when we lose a love relationship. It can occur sometimes when we lose a parent. Anytime you're in transition, you're particularly vulnerable to the appeal of the cults.
Elders and sisters, I'm delighted to be here with you, and this is an exciting topic, and we're so happy to have this opportunity to talk with you about working with members, retention, and activation. I'd appreciate it if you'd turn, please, to section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants, and read with me, if you would, please, verses 6, 7, and 8.
And you shall go forth baptizing with water, saying, repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And from this place ye shall go forth into the regions westward. And inasmuch as ye shall find them that will receive you, ye shall build up my church in every region. I want to emphasize 3 words, or 4 words, I guess, that are repeated in each of those verses. Ye shall go forth. Do you see that part about ye? Mm-hmm. When we talk about finding, we want to make sure that we're talking about our own responsibility to find people to teach. We can help find people to teach
when we develop the faith to do so. We need to develop the faith to find. We always find when we teach, and we teach when we find. What does that mean to you? How do you understand that? Any thoughts? Please, Elder Bigham.
I think always testifying, always looking for opportunities to share the gospel with, and when you do have someone you're teaching, always asking them for referrals or who they know that we can go and share this message with.
Good, thank you. If we're teaching someone, we constantly ask. We always look for opportunities to ask about who people know and who else do they know. The famous who else part, right? It's not enough just to ask who do you know. We always ask the second question, who else? And what's the third question?
Who else?
Who else? And the fourth, right? We always do that. Thank you. Here's a mistake that's fairly common. It is that a missionary or a pair of missionaries show up at a member's home and they simply ask for a referral. There's a better way. We ask them questions that start with, who do you know? So we're going to complete that thought now by asking you to read these slides. Let's just
So I'm just going to pause it here. It started out in this segment with Elder L. Whitney Clayton, just focusing on the idea that they're talking about recruiting members and how do you do that. And it's very much in line with a lot of high-pressure sales and to some extent multi-level marketing, where you're exploiting the social connections and networks of people that you are pursuing. So you're going to target the people, the network of the people that are already in your group. And now he's going to talk about what he's describing as the better way. So it's not just who do you know, but we've now got to identify people that you know who may be the most vulnerable and the most susceptible to a message that may transform their life. So here we go.
ask Elder Von Dorsten if you'd start. Will you read the first one underneath this who do you know, and start what you read with who do you know, will you please?
Yes, sir. Who do you know who would be interested in and benefit from the gospel message?
Thank you. Elder?
Who do you know who has an illness in the family?
Next.
Who do you know who has recently moved?
Who do you know who recently had a baby?
Who do you know who recently had a death in the family?
Thank you.
Who do you know who recently changed jobs?
Why do you think that these kinds of questions might be more likely to be useful in working with an active member of the church in trying to find people to teach? Let me take you to Alma chapter 32, and we'll read a verse there. In Alma 32, you'll recall that Alma was teaching in, he was teaching the Zoramites, and as he was teaching, he ran into this situation. Someone came up behind him and asked this question. This is verse 5. He said, "What shall these my brethren do, for they are despised of all men because of their poverty, yea, more especially by our priests." And then going to the end of that verse, "What shall we do?" Verse 6, when Alma heard this, he turned him about, his face immediately towards him, and he beheld with great joy, for he beheld that their afflictions had truly humbled them, a point one of you made, and that they were in a preparation to hear the word. These kinds of questions help identify people who are in a preparation to hear the word.
So there you can see that it is really intentional that the church targets people who have had traumatic or transitional things happen in their life. The church depicts it as something that has a religious theme to it, which is that they have been humbled, and now the pride that they otherwise may have, which would prevent them from being receptive to the message of the missionaries or of the prophets, that pride is now gone, so that they will be willing to hear and submit to the message of the missionaries. If you're a believing Mormon, that may sound really, really nice. But imagine that this was a training video from a Scientologist. Would you consider it to be really nice if the Scientologists were saying, hey, let's find people who are really destable in their life because they've had a major traumatic event, the death of a father, the death of a child, the birth of a child, they lost their job and they're struggling to make ends meet. Let's target those people and really get them into our group. You would see that as somewhat nefarious and exploitative because you're taking the normal kind of low points in people's life where they are vulnerable, and you're offering them a message of hope, but it's tied to this theme of obedience and deference, which goes along with it. We saw Margaret Singer, who is one of the foremost experts in how group psychology is exploited by these totalistic groups that we call cults. And she mentioned how they use a lot of flattery and good messages in order to attract people. And that's always the very first thing that you'll see. There's a term for that. It's called love bombing. And it's something when you are, first of all, targeting people who are very vulnerable, and then you show them an overabundance of love. And it's a fake form of love, a love that is not justified. So frequently, if you go to some of these groups, you'll see the leader stand up. And even though the leader doesn't know everybody, or they may be in a broadcast, they'll say, "I love all of you." And it's one of those things where when somebody is using the term "I love" or "I love you" while they're preaching that you must obey them because they represent God or something like that, it really cheapens the notion of that love, because you have to realize how love is used as a way to disarm somebody. If somebody starts out by saying, "I love you," then it conditions your mind to say, well, if they love me, then they would only do things that are in my interest. They would look out for my interests. And so I can let my guard down a little bit and accept what they say. It's a subtle thing, but it's a powerful psychological point that these groups use. So let's see now how this plays out in the video that was recently released by the church. So let me set that up now, and make sure we share the audio here. I am going to turn on some closed captions so that we can make sure we see it. And where are we in full screen? Yes. All right, so let's give this a look.
My beloved brothers and sisters, we're living in a remarkable age when we constantly see the hand of the Lord in the lives of his children. Our Heavenly Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, know us, love us, and are watching over us. Of that, we can be certain.
So I think starting off the bat, it's important to understand what this video actually represents. So apart from the critical perspective of the church, it's important to acknowledge and recognize that for members of the church, they consider the prophet to be a very significant spiritual figure in their life. He, from the believing perspective, stands at the interface between themselves and God. He is considered the spokesman for God, the mouthpiece for God. And so at a time when the entire world is gripped in this cloud of fear and uncertainty over this pandemic, there may be a lot of stress and anxiety in the minds of not only members of the church, but the entire world over. The members of the church have something special, though. They have a man who claims to represent God. And if God is all-knowing and all-loving, then he should have some special insight into how to make sense of all of these events. And so it makes perfect sense that the prophet would issue a statement that is targeted to members of the church but available to the whole world, and make it a statement of comfort. That's something that he is fulfilling his role in doing. Now, there's a side to this that people who are not members of the church may not realize, and that is that even in the name of the church itself, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that latter-day component of it is something that reflects the fact that the Mormon Church is one of these dispensational millenarian churches that has a strong belief in there being a great calamitous event at the second coming. So if you go back and you look at different things that have been taught by the church, you'll see that when Christ returns again, it is not going to be a period of happiness and joy for the world over. The saints themselves, if they have been obedient and done everything that the leaders have told them to do, will have a measure of protection, but the world over will have great destruction, great tribulation, and it's very much kind of the book of Revelations type of scenario. This is carried over in the theme of how they've taught about tithing. They've taught that tithing is fire protection so that you won't be burned at Christ's second coming. And so that ties in a very fear-based notion that if you're not staying on top of paying tithing to the church, then if Christ does show up again, and he'll show up and nobody can know when, then you will be burned. That is also tied to the fact that if you don't stay in the church, in the good graces of the church, conforming to the church, then you place yourself at risk. These sort of apocalyptic messages are things that you'll find in Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly. They've been softened a little bit in how the church has taught things in the modern era, but they still are there as much as they are integrated into the name of the church himself. The setup for this particular video, you can see, is very intentional. There's a small statue of the Christus figure in the background, somewhat blurred out, and the prophet is closely in focus. He has soft lighting on him, and you can see that he's got a very empathetic face, and there's a measured silence in the background. This is not accompanied by cheesy music or anything like that. It's very much this. Now, he's starting out by saying that we should all begin with the comfort that comes from the certain knowledge that Heavenly Father has his hand in all of our lives, and that God and Heavenly Father know each of us personally. And that makes sense. It's in tune with the Mormon message. The subtext here that you have to understand from the Mormon perspective is that as God's messenger, anything that President Nelson will say in this message that says that you need to follow God's commandments or obey God, it sounds like he's talking about God, but what he's really talking about is the things that he, as the prophet, or he and the other apostles who themselves are prophets, seers, and revelators, the things that they say are obligations on the membership themselves, because the church has taught that whether it's by his servants, the prophets and apostles, or by God, whatever is said by these men, it's the same thing as if God said it himself. And that may be fine when they're talking about loving your neighbor, helping those in need. It's when they tie it to other messages that aren't so clearly not in their self-interest. Things such as paying tithing on fear of burning at the second coming. Making sure that if you have a loved one that leaves the church, that maybe it's appropriate to leave your legacy, your will, your financial earnings that may come when you die to the church and its philanthropic arm, rather than to your loved ones if they are no longer temple recommend holders. All of these things are things that have happened in the past, but just realize that this is part of the messaging that's there. Again, some of this may not be clear to non-Mormons, and you'll see that the seeming conventional Christian words that are spoke in this video have resonated with a lot of people. It is, I think, it's almost 3 million views now, and it was a trending video on YouTube. It was the #1 trending video when it happened. So people may listen to this message and find it to be something that brings them hope, but that is partly if they're not Mormon, because they don't understand how these messages of comfort are tied to impositions of obedience. And it's the same thing that we covered on other groups, like what is depicted in the Path when they show up after the disaster. So let's keep going.
At the same time, as you are well aware, we as a global church are facing a unique challenge. COVID-19 and its resulting illness has affected thousands of lives and interrupted many regular routines. We pray for those who are suffering and for those who have lost loved ones. After prayerful consideration and with our deep desire to be part of the solution to this challenge, we have recently made many temporary adjustments to the way we worship and serve the Lord. We are most grateful for your faith, your prayers, your cooperation, and understanding. These unique challenges will pass in due time. I remain optimistic for the future.
Okay, so he starts out by talking about how the church is worldwide, and so it is facing some unique challenges. You can go to the Jehovah's Witness website, and right now on their front page they have a link to a video where they're talking about their challenges because they are also a worldwide church. And they're doing much of the same thing, which is they're talking about how they have had to adjust and adapt, how they have used their strong network of hierarchy and authority to empower people at the local level to act with the permission and guidance of their leadership. And it's very much the same thing. The challenge that he's talking about is not particularly unique to the Mormon Church. Every faith that has a worldwide presence is dealing with this issue. He's alluding to, when he talks about the different adjustments that have had to be made, he's alluding to the fact that the church has basically closed down all services worldwide and has closed down temples and has had made these adjustments. Now, what is kind of lost in all of this and what is a little bit unique to Mormonism is you may find other religions, for example, the Church of Christ Scientist, where they frame physical illness in faith terms, and it results in a culture that eschews medicine, and there's an element of shame that would go along with admitting that you're sick and going to seek help from a conventional doctor. In Mormonism, if you go back and you look at the very, very earliest days of Mormonism, the missionaries went out with the priesthood and they claimed to have the power to heal the sick. And there are a few newspaper reports where the missionaries gave blessings to people and they still died. You can look in church history when they moved into the swamps of Nauvoo and people were sick with malaria. And we understand that's what it was now. They probably did not understand it, and they didn't have an understanding of how that was spread through bloodborne illness by mosquitoes in the swamp area. But they did their best to try to heal people through priesthood blessings. There's a story that we covered in a prior video of Joseph Smith taking a red bandana and giving it to one of the apostles and having him wipe the faces of children as a way to affect their healing. This is, all things where religious people are trying to do what they can to save people suffering. And in those fraction of people for whom it works, the people who believe then that whatever the religionists did actually helped them will find themselves bound to that religion. Well, they healed me, and so I've got to now follow them. And in the case of what Nelson is doing here, Mormonism adapted from those early days. And now Mormonism is very much, God gave us science for a reason. God empowered us to train doctors and to discover the nature of disease. And so we need to listen to the experts and do what they say. And so it's a little bit of a different nature than you may hear from other churches, where Mormonism really does tap into what science has said to a certain extent. And that actually makes it a little more attractive to people who may be scientists and who may be doctors. Whereas other groups that particularly are against science, if you think about how the blood issue in the Jehovah's Witnesses, where they believe that the biblical restriction against consuming blood translates into refusing life-saving blood transfusions, it's a little bit harder for somebody who may be medically trained to reconcile those particular ideas. So he, in prayerful consideration, and also listening to the World Health Organization and experts who have said, listen, we've got to distance ourselves and try to slow the spread of this disease down. Well, the church has acted on that. And I think it's a credit that they're willing to listen to world authorities on secular matters and follow them. And it may be that we have the benefit, because Nelson is a doctor and he has a background understanding how the nature of disease works and how we can respond to and affect these things, then I think he's brought a perspective to how the church manages it that's a lot more healthy than it could have otherwise been. There are some articles now going about, because this is not the first pandemic that the world has seen. And you can go back to the Spanish influenza of 1918, I believe, and you can see that at that time the church had to do some similar measures in terms of calling off general conference or altering how practice service went. But you could imagine that at that time they were probably thinking the same thing, and that is that the prophets had been teaching for decades that the second coming was nigh. Suddenly you've got people dying by the millions in a pandemic that's around the world, and they were thinking at that time, well, surely this is it. These are the end times. These are the latter days. It didn't happen, and so now we are a century later dealing with another pandemic. And it's a little bit, we'll listen to see if he taps into those fears about the latter days and the last days and the tribulations that will surely come at that time, because that's just a very convenient bit of rhetoric for leaders of a church that believes in those Armageddon things to tap into to make people fearful and want to depend on them. So let's keep going.
I know the great and marvelous blessings that God has in store for those who love him and serve him. I see.
All right, so that's the first hint here that we have
and serve him
of the nature of what's going on here. So he's talking about how the Lord has many great blessings in store for those who love him and serve him. And if you're not a Mormon, you'll hear that and you'll be like, that is really good. I'm going to love and serve my God, and I'll have a lot of blessings. And for you, love and serve your God means to love your neighbor, and that's pretty much it. You don't also have to then view somebody who is in your life who's gay a different way, because the leaders have told you you have to do that. You don't have to fight against gay marriage. You don't have to see yourself as broken and fallen by just being human. There's all sorts of things that go along with what he's saying. And to Mormons, when the prophet says, love him and serve him, there's a whole lot of baggage with that, because serving him means that you have to attend your meetings, you have to do your ministering, you have to stay worthy and regularly go for worthiness interviews with your church leaders so that he can give you a recommend to go to the temple. In the temple, you have to raise your arm to the square and swear an oath that you will give everything that you have or ever will have to the building up of the kingdom of God and the church. You don't have access to marriage or an eternal family unless you obey all of these rules and can do it. There's just a whole lot of baggage that goes along with that, but that doesn't make it into this video. And of course it couldn't. This is the milk before the meat that happens. All right.
I see evidence of his hand in this holy work in so many ways. So during these uncertain times, be comforted by this promise from the Savior. He said, quote, I, the Lord, am bound when ye do what I say, close quote. I promise you that joy is always within the reach of everyone who will hear him and obey his laws.
Okay, and this is where it really kind of gets down to the meat of it. Okay, so let's go back to this particular line.
This promise from the Savior. He said,
okay, I, the Lord, am bound when ye do what I say. And this is a scripture that comes up very frequently in Mormonism. And it's something that gives you a what I would consider a false sense of autonomy and control over your life. Because it sounds like what you can do is you can read the scriptures, you can listen to the prophets, and they may say that you'll receive blessings if you pay tithing, good things will happen in your life, that your cup will flow to overfilling. And then it says, when ye do what I say. And so in your mind, you could say, well, I want those particular sets of blessings. And so in order to bind God, in order to compel God to give me those blessings, I am going to do what he says. And so it's a way that they've been able to instruct you to think that you're taking control over your life But in order to get that control over your life, you have to surrender your control to the demands and impositions of these men. You have to obey them in order to get control over your life. And it's kind of a double bind that is hard to see until you kind of dissect the different elements that they have in the messaging. And I think what is particularly troublesome with this video is that this message is what he's bringing out in the context of trying to bring hope and comfort to people who are really scared. You know, it would have been very possible for him to bring a video out that is simply talking about coming together as a world community, regardless of faith, showing love for your neighbor without strings attached, without having to put people under the umbrella of a hierarchy of authority. But instead, he's brought a message that dangles the carrot of joy and comfort and hope, and then hands you, you know, the shackles that go along of, you have to do what I say, you have to obey my law. And we could say, well, he's not talking about obey what he says, he's talking about obey what God says. But in Mormonism, what the prophets say and what God say are one and the same. You know, God is the one who tells you what you should know, but he does so by way of the prophet. And so that's just kind of the dynamic here. The second part of this,
quote, I, the Lord, am bound when ye do what I say, close quote. I promise you that joy is always within the reach of everyone.
That sounds good. Joy is within the reach of everyone. You know, that's great. But what is the condition for that joy?
Who will hear him and obey his laws.
So you've got him promising that people have access to joy, only people who hear him and obey his laws. Now, you have to be familiar with how the church is hashtag branding things right now. Hashtag hear him is the church's main focus for getting its message out and for branding it. So it's no surprise that that phrase has been incorporated into his message here, and then the church immediately after this was released, very shortly, released a video called Hear Him, talking about that theme. What you have to understand is, from a Mormon, the way that you hear God and hear the message of God is by listening to the prophets and what the prophets tell you God says. And obey his laws. Again, it's, you know, a message of obedience that is exploiting the fear and uncertainty that people have regarding this virus and holding joy and comfort captive to you doing what these men say. And he mentions here, he has confidence, he has optimism for the future. And I think he's an intelligent man. He probably understands, listen, the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 came, it did its damage, and then it passed. There were survivors and they rebuilt. That's going to happen again now. And so I can speak with confidence because there are going to be, you know, most people are going to survive this. It's only going to be people who are severely ill or older or have comorbidities that are going to be primarily at risk. There'll be a few other people who get hurt as well, but we're going to survive this. And now by making these statements of confidence, I can further, show that I have this power, that I have this confidence, that I have this assurance. But it's all tied to this message of obedience, which is really distasteful to people who don't already consider him to be the spokesperson for God. You know, it's offensive to hear some person say that you can only get the joy that God may offer if you obey them. You know, imagine a Scientologist making a worldwide declaration that there is joy and comfort that will be always within the reach of anyone who would listen to L. Ron Hubbard and obey his laws. You'd just be like, that's ridiculous. I don't consider anything about L. Ron Hubbard. And you have that detachment because it was L. Ron Hubbard. But imagine then if it was the God that you hold close to your heart. And so there are a lot of Christians in the world who would listen to this message and say, this man cannot place requirements on my relationship with God or the joy that I receive from God. And I don't have to obey the Mormon set of God's laws, because the Mormon set of God's laws is very different from any other Christian set of God's laws. Okay, so let's keep going.
And obey his laws. Brothers and sisters, please take good care of yourselves and your loved ones, and look for opportunities to help those around you, near and far. We have the great privilege of ministering to our neighbors wherever they live. Temporary changes in our normal routine may allow additional time to experience how precious home-centered gospel study can be. Don't hesitate to use the new Book of Mormon videos and other technology to study the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are all looking forward to General Conference. Then we will focus on the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ in its fullness. That gospel provides certain hope and help to a troubled world. I love you, I pray for you, and I promise that you will receive comfort and peace as you continue to hear him.
So there's a couple of things that come out in that video that are interesting, and they seem to cross signals with some of the things that he's done in the past. Let's see, the thing that really stood out to me was this notion that we will focus on the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ in its fullness. Now, Russell Nelson has made a very great deal of noise on the concept that the restoration is ongoing. You can't say that it is in its fullness if it's ongoing, because more things are being restored. And this is, I think, where the term restoration is becoming an undefinable cloud-like realm of possibilities, because he can make it mean anything. If something is being restored, then it's being restored to a prior state, and there is a point at which it will be at a prior state. But instead, we're considering the concept of restoration to be whatever we need it to mean on a day-to-day basis. If it's a message for the wider world, then we want this concept that something has been restored and it's here, because there's an element of surety, of authenticity, of legitimacy to that idea. But if you're trying to rationalize to members how things seem to be changing, things that were previously restored are changing and evolving, then you have to have this idea that the restoration is ongoing. So the theme of having leaders say one thing when it's to a public audience and something different when it's targeted towards member is certainly present there. The other thing is the concept that he has that, you know, we should all look for ways to serve and help our neighbors. Those are all very good messages. And it fits in this theme with, just like you saw in the path, they were going out and helping people. There's nothing inherently wrong with helping people for the purpose of helping your fellow human, for helping your fellow brother or sister or neighbor. That's all fine. The insidious part of it is when you're using that help, or the intention and targeting of that help is to get people to then have an obligation or a vulnerability to believe some of the messages that may start to weave themselves into the minds of the people and take control over them in a way that you would consider to be, you know, not good if some other group that you didn't already have deference to did. And so, and again, this is not like, you could feel gratitude to the Red Cross for helping you and your family out. But that doesn't mean that you now have to shape your entire worldview and your entire self-conception and your entire eternal soul to the things that the president of the Red Cross Association does. In Mormonism, when they extend that help and then you become enmeshed in that system, that, you know, overarching divine authority then takes its place in your universe, and it has a very large shadow. Okay, so at the end, he does that classic thing where he tells people that he loves them.
I love you.
You know, I love you. And when you hear a leader speak to a huge, large audience and say, I love you, that should be a red flag. You just have to say, wait a second, what is actually being said here? Because, you know, it's kind of like that Incredibles line from Syndrome where he says, if everyone is special, then no one is special. You know, if this man loves everyone, then what does love mean? Because he's saying he loves people who he doesn't even know exist. He doesn't even know them individually. So then if you're in this person's life and you know him and he says, I love you, he's like, well, you say that to someone that doesn't even know anything. You just have to understand it's a rhetorical device. It's meant to disarm people, to make them more susceptible to the message, because it imposes the idea that he only wants what's best for us. And it can be hard when you are born in and the only existence that you know in the church is the messaging of the church, but it does not hold true that what the church does and teaches is always in your best interest. And to see the proof of that, you can look at its history on race relations, its history on sexism and gender issues, and just see how wrong they've been and how damaging it's been in the lives of people. And then take that, put it aside, and look at the issues of toxic perfectionism, of rates of depression, of the type of support groups that are needed for people who ultimately do leave the church, the fear and anxiety that goes along with its message of apocalyptic doom that dangles salvation at the price of obedience. All of those things are inherent to the message of Mormonism. It just doesn't make its way overtly across the screen in a short 3-minute video. Okay, so, all right, hold on. This is good news. I've had a brisket cooking since yesterday, and apparently it has reached the ideal temperature, but it can wait for just a little bit more. Okay, so let's go ahead, and I think that's everything that I had prepared. There was one other thing I wanted to show, and that's you know, the root of this entire scenario is really summed up in a cartoon that you may have stumbled across. Let me see if I can find it here. Boop. Because if you're watching this video and you're not a Mormon, or you only have vague familiarity with the Mormon church, then you just have to understand that he is not simply a kindly old man who happens to lead the organization of the church. He, when he is sustained as a prophet and inserts himself into the lives of people who follow the prophet in Mormonism, he is God's representative on the church. When he speaks, he's not simply speaking of his own judgment, he's speaking as the mouthpiece of God. And so people will allow his message to affect their lives with much greater intensity, force, and significance than they would if he was just speaking on the strength of his own opinion. You know, you and I can speak on the strength of our own opinion and our best judgment. He speaks on the strength of a divine commission from God to represent God to the world. And so, you know, the ultimate expression of this, there's a great cartoon that you can find that shows this, where it has, you know, a man standing up saying, I am God's messenger. And people are like, well, what is God's message? Give God's messenger money. And that's essentially what it boils down to in the Mormon church when you look at the fact that their tithing doctrine is all tied on fear. You would just add to that cartoon the idea, give God's messenger money or you will burn, or you will not have access to the joy and happiness that you would otherwise have access to, or you won't have the comfort that goes along with being with your family in the eternities if you don't do what God's messenger says. So, you know, it's always difficult, I think, to tackle these issues in the midst of a tragedy. And you know, from a strategic point, just in talking about things, you always have to, as a critic, you have to say, well, you know, you can leave yourself open to the idea that you're simply picking on the church that is trying to help people. Just like you could in that video about the path, or when you look at the history of other groups like Scientology, you know, when they go after vulnerable people, you could say, well, they're just trying to help people. Why are you picking on them? But you just have to understand that Nelson understands this is a temporary thing, but what he can do now to both increase the idea that he is a divinely inspired representative of God and that you should follow him and equate what he says with God and marry that to the idea that you only have access to God's greatest blessings, to joy and certainty in this life if you obey his laws. That type of message is really just, it's dirty and it's exploitative. You did not, even from within the context of Mormonism, he did not have to have that obedience theme tied into that message. It very well could have been a message of love, of breaking down barriers between religion and community and saying, go out and help your neighbors without having there to have to be any religious obligation or theme or whatever. And that would have been much more effective. So I'm going to go ahead and see if anyone is interested in calling. You can dial 210-422-2222, and I'd be happy to take any calls. While I wait for the first call to come in, I'm just going to set that up. Give me a second. All right, so we can take a look at comments. In the meantime, I received a notice that because I played a copyrighted clip, I went ahead and got banned from Facebook, so the video will not show up on Facebook because a part of the path showed up. In the meantime, let's see what people have had to say. Somebody says, great series, The Path. I agree. Whoever it is that wrote the script for that just really understood the dynamic that groups that claim divine salvation and to be the key to your happiness, you know, they really have a way of getting under the skin of people who are vulnerable and causing a great deal of devotion. And I thought they did a phenomenal job. Autumn Leaves mentions that if you come from any kind of traumatic family situation and all you want is stability and normalcy, it's very easy to cling to the teachings of the church. I absolutely agree. I mean, part of the appeal that it has at being a family-centered church and promoting an image of a very unified family is that people who know the opposite of that in their own lives yearn for that. And so that's the sort of thing that they want to have. You can listen to President Nelson talk about his childhood where he had parents who drank, and he saw that as one aspect of a difficult part of his family life that he wanted to remedy. And it was through, you know, there's a famous story that he has where he got all their alcohol bottles and poured them down the drain, and he was trying to bring a measure of goodness to his family that he felt was lacking. And that's very much a part of the church. And there's a dark side to that, and that is that when the church has this very image-oriented, you can't have the appearance of iniquity, and it's married to a very strong and subtle theme. When I say strong and subtle, I mean it's not out in the open, but it's very present, of prosperity gospel, so that if you are well-to-do, you're going to be more wealthy, and you're going to project that image. All right, let's see what we got here. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Oh, hi, is this Jonathan?
It is.
Hi, I must not be watching live, but that's okay. I just want to ask a question.
Well, you are live. There's a little bit of a delay. So
okay,
it may
I
catch
see.
up.
Okay, well then first, I'm Natalie in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and first I'll apologize. I haven't watched your whole episode today, so
That's
my
okay.
question may be just slightly off topic.
Mm-hmm.
But it's I'm recently kind of surprised by something that I'm wondering about, and it's tithing and LDS philanthropies.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wait a second, does zero amount of our tithing go to humanitarian work? And I was wondering if you could clear this up a bit.
There's, I guess, a complicated way to answer that, and that is that if you go back a few years ago, there was a distinction between money that you donated that was considered tithing and then money you donated that went to a humanitarian fund or something like that. And so the church took in money that was designated by its donors as tithing and put that towards certain purposes that we really don't have any authentic, reliable insight into. There were some recent leaks that seem to depict what was happening in the church is that the church would use tithing money for its institutional requirements, and that is supporting the missionaries, that is building temples, meeting houses, and managing the day-to-day operations of the church on a global scale. And then it would take surplus from that and funnel it into an investment account or portfolio. And then that would continue to grow. And so every year they received more in tithing than they were using for its day-to-day operations. And then the surplus went into that continuing growing body of funds, which we learned earlier in the past year exceeds $120 billion. Now, a lot of that was in the stock market, and given how the stocks have performed, we don't know, because we don't have ongoing transparency, we don't know how much of that was affected by the changes in the stock market. Now, that's kind of an older thing. So back in that day, then you would also designate money for the humanitarian fund, which would go more towards what we conventionally see as charitable work. And you could also designate money to the missionary fund. And because you made those designations, the church had some obligation to see that those funds went to their intended purposes. But again, we had no transparency, so we had no idea what those actually went to. Now, on top of that...
right now...
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, right now, that's exactly what I was looking for. Was okay. Well, what's the transparency right now? And is what I found was a pretty decent amount of transparency, but of it saying what the tithing money goes for, like what you were just saying about temples and management and that kind of thing. And it specifically pointed me to this extra money that you would pay in fast offerings or whatnot for humanitarian work. And I'm looking at this $2.3 billion that's been through generous donations from individuals. Latter-day Saint Charities has provided over $2.3 billion worth of assistance in 197 countries since 1985. And with the new revelation of where they're sitting, it's quite embarrassing.
Yeah, it seems like a large amount of money, but when you stretch it out over 40 years and compare it to other charitable work, it's hard to say. And you know, you described what we're seeing now publicly as a great measure of transparency. I think it still falls short of that. A great measure of transparency would be where you see a balance sheet and you see exact numbers where things went to significant categories. You know, we have no idea how much the money has paid out in settlements to victims of child abuse that the church was involved in, either the cover-up or the actual committing of that abuse. And when I say the church involved, I mean representatives of the church who were in ecclesiastical positions of trust as they committed their abuse. We don't have any insight into that. The Catholic world was rocked once they eventually got the financial transparency that opened that side of their finances out. But, you know, that's just a drop in the bucket to what we could find out.
I'm not saying that I'm not applauding this transparency, but what I'm seeing, but I'm kind of asking, like, is what I'm seeing true, that none of the tithing is like, because that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Just send me to the...
Well, so
I want
to finish my thoughts on this. So number one, you're absolutely right. And the church has been no bones about it from the beginning. Tithing is not charity. And Russell Nelson himself, there's a video you can find on my YouTube channel where he specifically says, you know, if you give money to some other charity that does work for the poor or work for the needy, that is not tithing. Tithing is specifically 10% dedicated for the running, managing of the church. Now, when they talk about the charitable work that the church does, that's where, you know, as a Mormon myself, I considered that's what fast offering was for. You know, Mormons, for those of you that aren't familiar, will abstain from a couple of meals on the first Sunday of every month, and then they'll take the money that they would spend on that meals, give it to their local church leader, and then that money is used when there is a need. For example, if somebody has lost their job and can't pay their health insurance or rent, then they can go to the bishop, and the bishop will actually extend money to them that's usually drawn from the fast offerings of their group. And that's the real charitable charitable activity, I think, that members maybe sometimes think is happening with tithing, but it's not actually happening. Now, all of that being said, a few years ago, the church changed the tithing slip. And in changing the tithing slip, they changed a number of things. So at the bottom of the tithing slip as it exists today, it says that the church will make all efforts to use the funds that you give them for the purposes that you intend, but it reserves the right to use funds any way that they want. And so what the church essentially did is it created a kind of a Schrodinger cat box where the money goes in, and it could be tithing, it could be humanitarian fund, it could be anything else. And at any point that the church takes it out, it can use it for whatever it wants, and that'll determine what it is. And so the money goes in, the church has said it's a nebulous mix of tithing and non-tithing money. They could take money out and use it for, buying up a cattle ranch or whatever for a for-profit activity. I don't know if they do this or not, but the rationale is there, and they could say, well, that money was not tithing, because we told our donors that we'll try to use it for what we can, but we're under no obligation to do it. And they donated their money. They signed their name on the donation slip, agreeing that the church doesn't have to use it for what you donated it for. And there's some images. If you just Google Mormon tithing donation slip change, you can see some images where they have the two tithing slips side by side, and you can see the difference there.
I do remember that. I think I'm still just, even though I've been out for a few years, I'm still kind of shocked that that good feeling you used to get that was like
that you were helping people,
donating. Thousands of dollars and stuff. That there was kind of, so as other things came along, you're kind of like, I'm good. I tithe it, or whatever. So I guess there's a little bit of kind of this bad feeling I've got inside that's just like,
and you have you have the benefit of being able to feel that way because you're not still enjoying to always sustain the brethren in what they do.
Right.
My mother was a widow, and there were times where she continued to pay tithing and fast offering. For a period of time, the church imposed on her to house the missionaries, and I would talk to her about this, and she's like, I'm like, you're the type of person that the church is supposed to be helping, not continuing to demand things of. And her response was, there are people who are worse off than I am, and so I continue to give because it's my privilege to do that. And she takes a very sincere, faithful approach to her Mormon faith, and I always see that as a credit to her. I love her dearly. I just hate to see that men who are sitting on a pile of over $100 billion continue to put people in harder financial circumstances, particularly if they're already in hard financial circumstances, and seem to feel like they can do that. So, we talked in the entry of this segment about how all of these promises of joy and happiness that the prophet is giving in his message are tied to obedience. And what you're discussing here is just that aspect, that financial tithing aspect of the obedience that is not insignificant for people who join the church. I've interacted with other Christians, and they may not be as offensive or as offended as the notion of the church having a concept of donation that they call tithing, but when they hear that there's no annual financial detail of exactly how that money is going, they're like, how in the world why would you give money to any organization that is not providing the, waste, fraud, and abuse is a completely normal human thing. And that's why any institution that manages anything that they would consider to be sacred funds has to have that accountability to protect for that.
Yeah, that blind obedience or blind acceptance is pretty shocking when you come out. And I do have to say that that feeling, I had the feeling of it was a real brutal awakening when I got divorced and my family wasn't there and I wasn't being blessed. And my first thought was blaming God, and I had to call myself out, like, we know that God doesn't just, cause these things to us. But I thought in my head, but I knew that, but why am I feeling this? Where is this entitlement in my mind? Because I am there's this mentality I'm going through that is kind of feeling like I should have, this thing shouldn't have been this hard. And it's been a real process to break down that whole concept. And I think I was kind of hard on myself in the beginning of like, how could I have got that thinking in my mind? And because the church doesn't teach that, is what I kind of thought and
I don't know. The church. I don't know. The church may not explicitly teach it, but when I left, my stake president said, when your life, when it starts to fall apart because you've left the church, don't blame me. Don't blame the church.
Well, and listen to this. I watched a conference just this last time, I think October, and was just kind of taking up tidbits. All my 9 siblings are still in the church, and I'm the only one. And I was listening, and I could not believe it. There were at least 3 apostles or whatever speakers that literally said, I promise you, that good voice and stuff.
Yes.
And I had this empathy for this sweet little person that I'd been experiencing, because it was, they literally were promising me, It wasn't just your mind making it that way. They are,
You married those promises. Those promises with this idea that the Lord is bound when you do what he say. And it's like, it's no wonder that people had this expectation. But then when it doesn't come, they also have these messages that they can give you of, well, you weren't doing enough. You weren't going to enough meetings. You weren't praying enough. You weren't as sincere as you needed to be. And so it all points back to you, and there's that
right. And since
blame
I
reversal.
was in the stake at the time and everything else, it just I knew that where I was, and I wasn't going to go the route of blaming myself, but definitely a deep dive into soul searching and having the rejection of my family and not them understanding divorcing a emotionally abusive spouse. It kind of helps to not have to have their approval, even though I'm still navigating doing this alone. I think it actually made it easier when that identity crisis was coming apart.
Yeah. I kind of feel the same way in terms of there are aspects of having family members who are still under the spell of that type of indoctrination. There are some things that you have to wrestle with without them taking part in it, because they couldn't really bring the measure of understanding, and they would bring all these other toxic ideas into the journey that you're having. At the same time, how much more comforting would it be to have family members who you are close to, who you love, who weren't poisoned by toxic ideas, who could uphold and sustain you in your own journeys without this undercurrent of doubt and shame.
You know what? Right. You know what I felt like? I found a letter I love looking at the family history, and I found a letter someone uploaded of a wife that left the polygamous. So the 5 wives and this one that couldn't do it, and her letter to the spouse, the husband, and I thought, oh my gosh, I feel like that person, and the shunning and shame that didn't go down in history, saying she lived true and faithful till the end, that kind of a thing. It just showed me that my family and everybody is such a product of our upbringing and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and these journeys have been going on for a while. Yes. Thank you so much for your call.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Keep up the good work, Jonathan.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. All right, the phone line is now open. If you want to call in, the number is 210-422-2222. We're talking about how the church and other groups may pounce on instances of natural disaster, of personal tragedy, and tap into the fear that goes along with that to try to gain and bind members closer to them. Hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Jonathan Streeter, you magnificent bastard. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Thank you for doing this. I was hoping that you would. I'm really glad. What I saw, just two comments about President Nelson's message of hope. It's just like right over 3 minutes, and when I watched it, I was just so livid, and I see how only when you're out do you see how they layer things in. Just like one of your videos where Holland is reaming everybody at the Maxwell Institute. They'll give a little bit of this, a little bit of that, maybe a little positive thing or a little laugh, and then boom, they hit you with it.
Yeah.
So here he comes with the things you'd expect to hear, and what gets me out of all of the comforting scriptures he could have shared. He does the one from D&C 82, which is Joseph Smith. It's not even,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. It's Joseph Smith's far-reaching effect. So you're bound when you do what you say, obey, as you've been discussing with the previous caller and during this video. But it just made me livid. And then he doubles down on the home church, right? The home church program. So look, when they did this home church program, a year or so back, it sounded pretty good. But they did not do it because of any forbidding,
foresight or prophecy. Oh yeah, in a year we're going to really need this home church program.
Yeah, because you know what I thought when they did, it's like great, they're going to do it. They're doing this to save money and make it easier for the members maybe. But it was not. Everybody's giving him credit for where credit I just do not believe is due. And even when he said the last thing about taking your vitamins, on my wall, I get a lot of posts from my TBM friends. Oh, he knew, President Nelson knew, and no. This, I cannot believe. I believe just only because I was in the church so long as a TBM, but you just see you see BS around you. I got a kind of good BS detector, and I was a convert, so I wasn't raised in the church. There's some serious bullshit going on here, Jonathan. It is. It's maddening, but I wonder how many TBMs are catching on. It's like, that doesn't sound right. Why would you hit me with that scripture right now? The home, I don't know. What do you think about the home church thing as far as, that
Right.
whole thing?
Well, that came into being when the church was responding to, and struggling to find a way to respond to the trends that were happening in people not wanting to be religious, particularly young people leaving churches, not just Mormonism, but other churches. And then Mormonism kind of looking at itself and saying, well, what are some things that we can do to change this, to adapt to the fact that we're losing people and that trend is going to increase. And so by changing to 2-hour church and then having a curriculum with church at home, then I think there's a psychological benefit, and that is that when you fool yourself and when you do things to indoctrinate yourself, it becomes harder to break because you have to admit that you were complicit in your own indoctrination. And so there's a power to that. And the church does it with their whole myth of truth. Don't take my word for it. Pray and you'll get an answer from God. And so if you've gone through that process, now if anyone brings factual evidence from you, you can say, well, I've had my own personal testimony and witness that it's true. So regardless of evidence, I have no communicate yourself from false paradigm of truth when you yourself are bound into it. And I think to some extent this home church program has that, because now it's not like, if you're growing up in the church, it's not the church leaders that are lying to you. It's mom and dad who are teaching you these lessons. You're getting a message not from some dentist who happens to be the bishop. You're getting a message from your mom and dad about how the church is. Now, how successful are they going to be in that? Because it then creates a lot more work and a lot more energy that has to be expended in order to engage in the church when you can't just go and sit in a pew and fall asleep. You actually have to pull out the lesson manual if you're the dad and say, okay, what are we going to do? And, we're seeing this now with people posting photographs of their home church in this period where people are encouraged to do this at home, where I saw one photo where they set up a little podium with a little microphone, and they had a youth speaker, and they tried to replicate the sacrament meeting experience at home. And I'm sure from the believing Mormon perspective, it's kind of a fun thing to do. Just from an outsider's perspective, when you look into that, you're like, that the point of religion, the point of a connection with God, doesn't have to be framed in this weird old style church atmosphere, even in the confines of your home. But it just shows you how strong the cultural aspects of the church are. I personally, I think when I just look at myself, when I was a believing member, if I had this come follow me thing, I would probably feel a lot of guilt over not doing it the way that I'm supposed to be doing it. But I'd probably be like, this theme about loving your neighbor, there's a Disney cartoon that teaches that really good. Let's watch that cartoon. And that would be like how I teach. But that's just, I know that there are parents and church members who take this way more seriously. And so I'm glad I'm not a kid in their household.
Right. And if you haven't, the one benefit about home church is I've got my cat sleeping on me literally, and you've got Yugi.
Yeah.
I'm glad you let him run free. He should just be able to do whatever Yugi wants. That's what I say.
Yeah. Well, I'm finding treats buried under pillows and blankets all over my house now.
That's his job.
Yeah.
Hey,
okay.
John, you're doing a great job. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Man.
Thanks for the call.
All right. Bye.
Bye now. All right. The lines are open again. If you want to call 210-422-2222, would love to hear from you. We're talking today about the recent message from the prophet of the church and how it's a unique manifestation of the church's strategy of really striking at moments of vulnerability and destabilization in order to dangle its message of hope and salvation at the price of obedience. And it can be manifest in a number of different ways, some of which are more blatant than others. It's surprising how blatant the prophet was in his video, where he specifically said that the blessings and the joy that God has in store come at a price of obedience. But to any church member that's been paying attention to Nelson, you'll know this is pretty standard Nelson. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. How are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me on your show once again.
What's on your mind?
So I just had a thought about all of this that we have been discussing on Things and Stuff, is that, it's a very, I wrote it up on the chat too, and I'll just kind of paraphrase a little bit, but basically the Mormons' notion of love is very, very conditional. And I grew up in the church all of my life. I served a mission. I got married in a temple and all of this and that. But when it comes down to it, when, the bottom line of their doctrine, and this is something that they don't tell their investigators, or they don't tell the people who are listening to, these prophetic messages that the leaders at the top are telling everyone, is that they share this notion and this concept that, we love everyone unconditionally. God loves us as his children, unconditionally, no matter what happens. But at the core of their doctrine, once you know and you start getting into the doctrine of Mormonism, it's very, very conditional. And I think you've hit some points on that. Regarding tithing, regarding, commandments, obedience. It's very, very conditional. If you don't do as the Lord says within our gospel and our church, then our love can only go so far. And it always bothered me because I thought, as rebellious as a child is, or as bad as a child may get, does a father ever stop loving his child unconditionally? He may, just say, well, I'm not very happy with the things that maybe you're doing, but I don't think love would be cut off or, decline just because of the child's quote unquote disobedience. So the church has a very conditional approach to love, and that was what my main concept was here, is that it's very, very controlled, and if you don't do as we say, then you're not entitled to his love, because like in Doctrine and Covenant says, if you don't do as I say, then you have no reason to come and ask me for the love and the things that I have prepared for you. And this is something that I grew up in my home, as a kid. My father would always throw these things at us, and my mother would always throw these things at us. Well, you're not doing what I ask you to do, and you're not doing what God's telling you to do. So, why should I care about you, or why should I bless you? Why should I take care of that for you? And now that I am an adult, and I see that, I'm saying, I may not have kids, but the day that I do, I will never treat them the way that I was treated, in a very conditioned type of love, only because things are not as they should be with people. Anyway, love your show, love what you're doing. Thank you so much for your presence in this platform, and you have a good day.
I really appreciate your comments. I think this notion about the nature of Mormon, the Mormon conception of divine love being conditional, is something that kind of smacked me across the face when I first started exploring it. Because like you, as a believing member, I thought that was the way that God's love should be defined and expressed. But it was actually President Nelson himself who taught us otherwise. I'm going to see if, because while you were talking, I recalled this, and I wanted to see if I could bring it up in a way that will work here. So if I come here, all right, let's see.
While you're doing that, I just wanted to add that that I think a lot of people, my friends and family who are still true believing Mormons, they have this idea where it's like, you can't be blessed enough if you're not doing what God is expecting of you. And I can tell you right now, Jonathan, that from personal experience, I have so much, if you want to call it blessings that I have in my life now, that I am just overwhelmed today as a ex-Mormon of how much I feel that I've been deserving of now that I'm out of the organization. I told my father the other day, I said, listen, I know you don't believe me, but I am at the happiest moments of my life now that I am out. That is very hard for a Mormon to understand, because they see their love as rewards, as for the conditioning that they are expected to fulfill within the gospel and the doctrine. And when you're out of that gospel and doctrine, they're thinking wickedness was never happiness. You can never be as happy as I am,
Yeah, that's that whole captured happiness sort of thing. Okay, I'm going to try to show this screen. I don't know if it'll let your audio stay at the same time, so we'll try it here. Okay, so this is, okay, I think I can still hear your audio. So now if we look at, this is an article called Divine Love by Russell M. Nelson. And it starts out, while divine love can be called perfect, infinite, enduring, and universal, it cannot be correctly characterized as unconditional. And, this talk that just totally surprised me, he goes on and he talks about, divine love is perfect and infinite, it's enduring, it's universal, yada, 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 but it is also conditional. And, he starts out saying it cannot be correctly characterized as unconditional. The word does not appear in the scriptures. And that whole rhetorical device of, well, this word doesn't appear in the scriptures, so we don't have to do it. We saw that on the concept of apology from President Oakes. Well, the word apologize does not occur in the scriptures, so the church never does apologies. But then, here we see this as a way to alter the divine conception of love. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it really is. Because even from the believing perspective, you could frame the notion that there are things that God expects of you in a way that is separate from whether or not God loves you. But Nelson specifically has not done that. He specifically said that divine love is conditional, which is, again, it's one of these tacit threats of, if you don't obey, if you don't do what he says, then you are outside of the realm of divine love. Divine love is going to be withheld from you.
And ordinance, but the minute that one of their partners starts doubting in the doctrine or starts doubting in the ideas of, maybe this isn't the church that I thought it was, they're conditioned to think, well, you know what, I have grounds to divorce you because the love that exists between this bond of marriage is conditional if you don't do the things that you're supposed to do within the temple obedience and all these things that are intertwined with each other. So your love is very conditional too. Your marriage is very conditional. I can divorce you according to bishops and according to stake presidents and all those who abide in that leadership if you don't do as what the doctrine has told you to do. Pay tithing, go to the temple, don't question the leaders, sustain them, do everything that you're supposed to do. Once you start doubting and questioning, then at that point, people are very conditional. And I think it was very important that we mentioned that.
Yeah. I want to reiterate, because while I had that screen up, I had never tried that before, having both you as a caller and the screen up, your audio cut out. So we missed the first part of that, where when we were looking at the article, you commented on just look how brazen and out in the open this concept is, and how much it colors the way that the church teaches God's love, where it's really absolutely dependent on you obeying in order for you to feel like you are deserving of or get God's love. And that transition into what you were just talking about, how that model of God's love is then transposed into our interpersonal and family relationships, where it even empowers in a husband-wife situation if one of the members of a couple decides that the church is not for them or does not conform absolutely to what the church says, then they now have a divine pattern for withholding love from them. And when people are, love bombing you when you're an investigator in the church, that love is also conditional, because if you then reject the church, well, you're not going to see that type of connection and love from someone who may even be your neighbor, because you are no longer a potential convert. Whoa, Yugi, you got chill.
That is correct, Jonathan. I just wanted to kind of touch a little bit on that since the audio was cut off, and I just got to say, I mean, nothing in Mormonism is ever so clear. I used to think that it was so simple to understand, and it was just so straightforward. But then when the hand of the church was forced to take measures to display the messiness and the confusion that lies within their doctrines and their teachings, it all became so convoluted and just so disturbing, just as we see in that article now, where they're, explicitly saying, like, look, what you think about unconditional love is really not unconditional, and it's very conditional within our grounds of religion.
Yeah.
So, that should be a huge red flag to investigators and members of today, that your love, by sustaining these leaders and by abiding by these doctrines and these teachings, just know that your love is and will be conditional as long as you do those things, because outside of that, you're basically apostatizing. You're basically not going according to the doctrine.
Yeah. Very well said. Thank you so much for your call.
Anyway,
I agree. It's a very important facet of this whole issue.
Thank you so much for your time and for what you do. Once again, if I call you again at some point, I'll be glad to just, give my opinion on things. But I think you're doing a great work. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for the call.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. So I apologize for the audio issue. I had just tried that for the first time using this platform, and I'm going to have to find a different solution for being able to pull up a web browser while I talk to someone. Let's see, comments. We've got, hey, Dan Rogers says hi. Dan is a good friend of mine who really was there with me from the beginning of my own journey. I still remember the first time we went out to eat together, and he asked me, have you heard about this thing called the Swedish Rescue? And I'm like, the Swedish Rescue? What's that? Dan's a great guy. Okay, so let's see. I think this may have been the comment that our caller was referring to. The Mormons' notion of love is very conditional. The only reason they sell the idea that their God loves unconditionally is because outsiders are ignorant and unaware of his true gospel. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, John, it's Dan.
Oh, hey, Dan.
I
How's it
decided
going,
to
man?
call in.
I'm glad you did.
It's good. I just wanted to, I had a couple comments. I'm just, staying at home, hiding away from coronavirus. And the first thing I wanted to say is I did home church before it was cool.
Yes, you did.
I got in trouble for it, but evidently, I guess I was just a trendsetter on that.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about the interplay, or get your thoughts on the interplay. You know a little bit about the Remnant movement, and I've been semi-associated with that. So that's the first little perspective I'd love to hear.
Sure. So for the viewers that may not be familiar with it, there has been for a few years now a significant movement in Mormonism of people who have been dissatisfied with the direction that the church has been taking for some time now, where it's become much more corporate, much more obedience-centered, where the leaders of the church themselves take a great deal of energy and effort to place themselves as kind of, in between the member and God. And people who have been dissatisfied with that have really been, I think, illuminated by some of the writings of Denver Snuffer, who himself was a Mormon, and talked and wrote about his own perspective and experiences, in some cases some what he described as very sacred experiences in his connection with God. And it's resonated with a lot of people who have found a new direction that is probably better characterized as what they see Mormonism as. And so collectively, that group has been called the Remnant, but they're not a collective. They're, it's very much returning to some of the original mindset of Mormonism under Joseph Smith, where people are entitled to their own revelation, and there's a whole bunch of, things that go along with that. But that should kind of bring people sort of up to speed on that. There's a lot more to cover regarding the Remnant, but what's been going on, and what can you tell me, Dan?
I'm obviously I was going through my faith transition. I looked at Denver Snuffer and found a lot of that attractive, like you expressed. It kind of felt like the Mormonism the mystical Mormonism that we kind of were promised that didn't exist. And it's just been kind of interesting to see the movement. And, it's like you said, there's really not a lot of coherency, I would say, in the whole thing, because everyone's very crazy. And some people are like LDS 2.0, that they do, I think I heard you talking about home church. A lot of the Remnant movement, they've been meeting at home for years now, and then some of them are very formal, and they assign talks and do that. Others are very informal. It's just an interesting thing to see that type of. I think there's some energy that was involved that probably existed. It's probably what got the whole thing started in the first place. But then to see, how things have shifted has been kind of a.
Can you tell me a little bit about how? Because I know, Mormonism itself has this allusion to end times in the name of the church, and so that thread, at various times in its history, has been more out at the front. How has the writings and teachings of Denver Snuffer and the general mindset of people that are exploring that aspect of Mormonism, how are they treating this? Is this very much like a sign of the times, end time sort of thing, and now we're sifting, or what is it perceived as?
I think my sense from, and I'm not as integrated into the movement as others, but my sense is that there's definitely kind of a prepper mentality, end times type thing. This is a pestilence that people quoting scriptures about earthquakes and pestilence, and pestilence is like an infectious disease or something. So I definitely think that they swing towards that type of end time mentality. Maybe even with a little bit of the idea that the pridefulness of, we really know the truth or whatever, or we're the ones that are really prepared. So
that it seems like, I don't look at the Remnant movement as an insider, and there's aspects of it that I'm not familiar with. I only have a very small window into it. Much of it was informed by you, actually, in our early conversations, and I think the movement has probably become much more complex, even from when we used to go out and talk. But I see other groups kind of capitalizing on this. Does the Remnant movement use these events and then maybe because I know the church is afraid that all these Remnant people are meeting secretly. They're attending conventional Mormon church and then, talking to people in the foyer and trying to maybe entice them with this new perspective on Mormonism. Are they using these end time stories to do that?
Hey, sorry, I had to open the door here, but
that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's hard to define the movement because, again, it's so broad and there's a lot of perspectives there. And you kind of have the former a voice of warning type crowd that really swing towards that, and other ones that are a little bit more, and that maybe brings up my second point is, I still associate with Remnant people, and we were on a Zoom call yesterday just talking about stuff, and I think the discussion that we were having was about this unconditional love idea, and in Mormonism, we're taught that mankind is inherently evil almost. So there's this like lack of trust in the goodness of humanity.
Yeah.
And I think I think that, what you were discussing is how, maybe humans are, mostly decent, mostly good. There's always a bell curve. You're always going to have people that are really bad and people that are saints. But the middle ground, you can probably count on your neighbor to be mostly good. So I think there's some of that in there as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that it just shows you as a pattern of how this, the thought processes that go along with how this group and other groups define insiders and outsiders, and then use that us versus them thinking to sort of demonize people that are on the outside. And the church has significantly softened that rhetoric now, but you don't have to go back too many decades to find when the church was characterizing Catholics as the great and abominable whore, and the outside world as fallen and depraved, and it was the church that was going to be the light of the world for people to do that. And you just think that people growing up with that mindset carry it with them, and we see that evident. There's a video I found of President Ballard, who's now the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. When he was talking to young single adults in South America, he talked about the distinction between Catholics and Mormons, and how Catholics don't even know who Christ is or who the Holy Ghost is, which would be a very offensive thing to say to a Catholic. But this is the private inside conversation, and it's just a little bit of insight into that black and white, us versus them thinking that is still under the surface, even if we, for political reasons in America, the church has to say, well, we take a ecumenical, we're all in followers of God, and we all are interested in freedom of religion. And it's very strategic, it's very political, and there's still that us versus them thinking and behind it all.
Yeah, I think that exists, and that's still kind of evident in,
Yeah, well,
I've definitely seen it show up. So.
Yeah. I think it would be great maybe sometime in the future, if you're open to it, to do a more targeted exploration of some of the themes of the Remnant. I will tell you that one of the things on my to-do list is to take a look at the very first statement of covenant that was given by Denver Snuffer. There was a conference that was held where they had the metal plates that they hold up, and then Denver had put out a statement in the first person of God speaking, and then a response to that. And when I read that statement and saw it, I saw a lot of the similar threads of manipulation, frankly, that I see in some of the church stuff. And so one of my goals is to explore that and see if that is true, if that is the case. Is that something that I would criticize in Mormonism itself? And if you're, definitely want to invite you to watch that. I don't know if you want to be part of that conversation, but that'll be something in the next few weeks.
Yeah, I'd be on board with being a part of that. I was involved and might be able to provide some behind the scenes perspective.
Oh, that would be great.
So.
All right. Well, It's always great to hear from you, man.
Yeah, nice talking to you, John.
All right. Take care. All right. So, let's see here. We'll go back and catch our comments. Okay. So on the theme of the conditional love of Mormonism, one of our earlier callers talked about how it modeled a type of love that was conditional that then bled into your family life. We have one person saying, totally agree. The best thing about leaving the church is realizing that I can love my kids no matter what. We have a great relationship and they don't keep secrets from me. They don't have fear. And that's one of the things that I think is very powerful about stepping outside of this very strict, rigid model of control. And while you're in that model of control, you don't see it as a model of control. But if you have a child that decides to do things or say things or believe things that are contrary to what the prophet says, then you see that child as somehow less than, somehow wicked, somehow being deceived, somehow following a path that is apart from the covenant path. And so it changes your relationship with them, because now you've got, as a parent, a drive or an impulse to steer and redirect that child back to the covenant path. And it sends a message of being less than, being not quite good enough to your child, because they understand that as a parent, you don't accept them as an individual making choices that are apart from your own or from the authorities. And that's a model that seems normal when you're in the church, because you have the entire conception of the world and what is right and wrong is defined by the church. But when you let go of that, and when you realize that the authorities defining that world for you have no legitimate basis upon which to define that, and you step outside of it, then you can start looking at your children as dynamic human beings who have every right to explore different ways of thinking and different ways of defining themselves and looking at the world. And you can love and support them in those stages of life in a way that maybe if you grew up in the church, you never had the opportunity to yourself. And it's something that can actually bring you closer together as a parent and as a child. And that doesn't mean that you're never going to warn your child of potential dangers. You're not going to try to show them what types of red flags exist in relationships between individuals or with a group. And in some cases, having kind of grown out and apart from the church, you are now more aware of the dangers of certain types of relationship. You're aware of how love can be used as a weapon, and how groups and individuals can impose their own priorities on you in a way that is unhealthy. And when you try to complain about it, or when you try to push back against it, that can be turned back on you as a form of blame shifting. These types of things can be protective in helping people avoid relationships with narcissistic personalities and other harmful relationships as they grow. So there's a measure of health that comes from learning and growing in these ways that you can then start to educate and bond with your children over. It's an important part of that relationship that I feel like you're closed off to if you can only see your parental relationship through the lens of what world the church defines. Okay, so if you'd like to join the conversation, it is 210-422-2222. Let's see here. What other comments do we have? I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Escaped. Yugi? Yeah, he's terrorizing the cat now. Heidi says, why are there not more branching off from the Mormon church? And if you do a deep dive and study this, there are hundreds of branches off of the Mormon church. What we're seeing with the Remnant is probably one of the more recent novel branches, new ones that aren't a schism of a schism. And I think there's something ideologically powerful in what motivates and drives people that move off into the Remnant group. But I don't know. It seems like in the past, people had a worldview that had to be defined by some religious authority, because that's just all that people knew. And now people who reject any form of religious authority, even if they define spiritualism for themselves or they reject spiritualism for themselves at all, there's not a high price to pay in our society to adopt that perspective on the world. There's no shame in somebody saying that they're an atheist in most of the wider world, outside of certain countries where there may be a death sentence for that. Okay, so somebody else says, the expression of love in the church is very conditional. It's tied very closely to doing, as in crossing off the to-do checklist. Once you opt out of the checklist mentally, well, you're screwed. And, it's kind of like a double-sided thing. Once you opt out of the mental checklist, hopefully you've done that in a way where you've studied enough about how the system works that you can realize that you are worthy of love, and that your own sense of worth and value is not tied to that checklist, and that the men who created the checklist in the first place did so from a false position of authority and have no right to define how your worth is attached to that checklist. And that you can start from that more central autonomous perspective, meaning that your focus of control and worth is found within you and not external and related to this false authority paradigm. And then you can grow from there and start to rebuild your self-concept and your worldview from that perspective. And the difficulty of this thing about this checklist is that it's not so much what maybe you think in your mind, but it also colors how the other people in your life view you. Even if you've thrown away the checklist, the other people who love you, who are central to your life, may not have thrown away the checklist, and they may still see your worth and your value and your place in the world as defined by your relationship to that checklist. And that's where it becomes particularly difficult in mixed faith marriages. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi. What's on your mind?
My name is Susanna. I've been watching your videos for a while. I am not a former Mormon, but I would consider myself an ex-evangelical. And you know, in the churches that I've been to, the conditional love is much more subtle. But when I was watching the video of President Nelson, it's like really obvious that love is conditional, or there is a transactional thing in order to get God's blessing. And I just wanted to make that comment.
Oh, so explain a little bit what you mean by transactional. I think I get a sense of what you mean, and that's a brilliant word for it.
Yeah, if you do this, and then God will bless you in your life, good things will happen. You get out from under that, you know, list of to-dos, then God is not there for you anymore. And so listening to him, it's really obvious. And you would think that people would just go, ooh, toxic. But if you've been under that all your life, it's probably pretty normal, I would think, especially now, you know.
Well, you know, you coming from the evangelical perspective probably had a little bit more of center of the world within yourself. Because it was kind of, I mean, the way I understand it, a lot of that is just you and your relationship with God can be kind of a one-to-one thing without somebody standing in the middle, kind of setting the requirements for it. Of course, I know it's more complicated than that when you get certain pastors and stuff like that. But, you know, in Mormonism, a lot of what you accept is defined by who is saying it. And so if I heard some, you know, preacher on the side of the street saying the exact same words, I'd be like, that's ridiculous. But if I hear the prophet saying it, then I'm immediately going to accept it and I'm going to defend it. And if anyone else criticizes it, then I'm going to show them how they're wrong. And it's just, I can appreciate that, you know, you having never been in that space, having never been a Mormon and seeing these men in that place can see that as just like, it's so obvious. But I would tell you, like, I mean, I just, because I can look at these videos and say, how would I have accepted this when I was a believing Mormon? I would have totally bought it up. I've been like, I have such, it's, you know, he's a doctor, look at his eyes. They're puppy eyes. You know, they look so kindly, and he's got that gentle voice, and he does a brilliant job. You know, I've heard people describe it as creepy, but when he's the prophet, it's gentle, and there's these pauses. And I mean, there's this thing called heart cell, which you may not be familiar with if you've never been a Mormon, but it was a brand of a way to convey emotional knowledge, emotional impact in something that you would do. And the church owned a media company called Bonneville Communications, and one of the things that they marketed was this notion of heart cell. So if you were some other company or business and you wanted to elevate your message with an emotional impact, you could enter into a contract with their communication media arm, and they would help, you know, take your video and give it that heart cell bump. And that would be through using the right type of music, using the right type of emotional swell. And the church does this really, really well. When you go to the YouTube channel for the church, there's a video they just released called Hear Him. And there's no spoken word on the video at all. It's all music and image, and it's just beat after beat, things that they know will tug on people's heartstrings. They're very good at it. So you're getting a little sample of that.
Yes, I I do feel where I relate to it, it was like when I went away from the evangelical stuff, I felt judged.
Yeah.
But it wasn't because I want to go out and sin. And I would say most people who get out from the church of, Mormon church, they're not going out because they can't stand the culture or they want to go out and sin. It's not the case. And so that's how I relate.
Yeah.
And I have extended Mormon family on my husband's side. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for your call.
Sure. And I love your dog. He's cute.
Yeah. He's a stinky butt.
Thank you, Jonathan.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. Let's see here. In terms of other comments, Eric says, it feels like you're part of a corporation, not part of Jesus Christ Church. There's a rigid sense of do, despite saying we love you no matter what. I think that speaks to that transactional nature of God's love that's articulated in the video that our caller described. It's kind of a mixed bag. The fact that the church is very much works focused and productivity, leadership focused. As a young man in the church, every time I went to church, the whole concept that was drilled into me was that, we've got to train you to be leaders. And, that puts you in positions where you're giving talks, where you're organizing meetings, where you're doing things that maybe somebody outside the church doesn't really have much experience as a young man of 14 years old doing, but you're doing it regularly. And that puts you in a good position for when you're placed in a professional environment, when you pursue academic education. You've already been introduced to that. And so you marry this do, very works-based transaction approach to your religion, and it puts you in a good place for being a professional. And so you go through your academic career, your professional career, you start to generate an income and stability that are somewhat tied into the way that the church indoctrinates and inculcates its people. There are organizations that intentionally and specifically don't do this. Jehovah's Witnesses teach their members that time that they would spend going above and beyond for their work or for college or for higher education is wasted time that they could be spent doing the work of spreading the gospel, according to Jehovah's Witnesses. And so people that leave their organization generally don't have the type of resources that someone from Mormonism may have when they leave, because their life has been shaped and molded by a religious framework that demeans and diminishes professional education. Mormonism very much promotes, and they want you to do that. And if you can marry advancement in professional position and accumulation of wealth and management of large institutions, if you can marry that to also being church broke, doing what the brethren say, fulfilling all of your callings by asking how high when you're told to jump, then you become good fodder for elevation in the leadership. And so you may become a stake president. If that works, you may become a mission president. If that works, you may become a 70 and another 70 in the first quorum, and then an apostle. And it takes decades to travel that journey. But at the end of that journey, you will have proved yourself again and again to be a company man, to prioritize the needs and priorities of the church over anything else. And that's why when you look at the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, you're going to find numerous multimillionaires who have been leaders in their field, heads of corporations. That's the marriage of that projected image of wealth and prosperity and the administrative and business acumen that goes along with it is the sort of thing, when it's married to deferring to the brethren, that's the sort of thing that will get you far in the church. All right. Well, we're working on 2 hours now. I think we probably had a good enough discussion for today. I want to thank those of you who were able to call in and wish all of you the best of luck. Stay safe and as far away from the people that would give you unnecessary exposures as possible. In the midst of this pandemic, we are all trying to do what we can to limit the spread of the disease so that our hospitals are not overwhelmed and are able to take care of those who are the most vulnerable among us that may need the most help at that time. So if you're stuck at home, encourage you to remain that way. And certainly pay attention to the news and the advice of people like the World Health Organization and the CDC, who are trying to bring to bear the best scientific knowledge that we have on how to keep our community safe and how we can start to reboot things once the worst passes. All right, and this has been Talk on Things and Stuff. Thank you all for attending. This is the end of our home church.